Being a sheltered suburbanite, I didn't know any Jewish or Muslim Americans until the 1980s when I joined the nuclear weapons freeze movement. I attended a holiday party and greeted one associate with "Merry Christmas." She answered, "We don't celebrate Christmas, we're Jewish." Eventually, I befriended Jewish American families in Cleveland Heights, where I worked. Some started sharing their stories of life in Israel. "We used to talk and barter with Palestinians at the market," Libby told me, until the Second Intifada. Intifada, an Arabic word, means uprising. This can be nonviolent, like the first Palestinian Intifada in 1987 was for the most part. The second Palestinian Intifada in the year 2000 was much bloodier. It wasn't until after the September 11, 2001 World Trade Center attacks that I started to meet Muslim and Palestinian Americans in Greater Cleveland. An Arab American man had been attacked with a baseball bat on Cleveland's west side in retribution for the 9/11 attacks. He was from the Beit Hanina community, which represents a large segment of Palestinian Greater Clevelanders who emigrated from that East Jerusalem neighborhood. My social justice activist comrades became alarmed at the surge of anti Muslim, anti Arab attacks and President George Bush's newly implemented policies targeting Arabs, Muslims, and South Asians in the U.S. We decided to call a public meeting to discuss the backlash against our Arab American neighbors here and nationally. We met at a Palestinian-owned restaurant, the Sahara, on Lorraine Avenue and West 125th Street. The place was packed. Eventually, I began to hear the other side of the story from the sons and daughters of the people who in 1947, 48, or in 1967 were murdered or uprooted from their homes, villages, and cities in historic Palestine in what is now Israel. I learned that settler colonialism was at play in Israel-Palestine, like what occurred with the creation of the USA and the genocide of indigenous people from the 1600s until today. I also discovered that our government has been funding military aid and funneling military aid and providing diplomatic cover for Israel since its inception. U.S. taxpayers give $3.8 billion in weapons every year. At the United Nations, the U.S. has vetoed condemnation of Israel 34 times since 1965. Our own Cuyahoga County government has purchased $19 million worth of Israeli bonds, which fund the illegal occupation of Palestine. The state of Ohio has invested $187 million in the Israel bonds. Due to the unjust U.S. war in Iraq and the U.S.-funded occupation of Palestine, I decided to travel to the Middle East in 2008 with a global exchange refugee tour. We traveled to Jordan and Syria to learn about the refugee crisis and how military interventions and their aftermath. I learned a lot, and we did get one fun day where we went to the Dead Sea and to the ancient city of Petra, popularized in an Indiana Jones movie. 1 month after I returned from the trip, George Bush finished his presidential term, and Barack Obama was soon to be inaugurated as the first African American U.S. president. This should have been a time of celebration, but Israel began a bombing campaign in the Gaza Strip, Operation Cast Lead, which lasted for the 3 weeks between presidents with no one at the helm in the U.S. With the Mideast trip under my belt and a new reason to return, I jumped at the chance to help organize a delegation to the Gaza Strip with a Palestinian American journalist that lived in Cleveland. We pulled together 2 medical doctors, a social worker, a filmmaker, and other activists, including Arab and Jewish Americans. In March 2009, our Gaza delegation met in Cairo, Egypt. We had arranged to buy water filter units there, which we planned to give to hospitals and social service agencies in Gaza. When we got to the border city of Rafah, we were refused entry to Palestine by the Egyptian border guards. After 2 days of being turned away, we decided to set up tents and camp out until we were allowed into Gaza. Finally, on the third day, another group came to the border, a much larger group sponsored by the women's anti-war organization Code Pink. They were there in honor of International Women's Day to show solidarity with the women of Gaza and to distribute care packages. Famous author Alice Walker was with them. Behind them was an even larger delegation from Britain with 100 trucks sponsored by British parliamentarian George Galloway. With all that activity, the Egyptian border guards led us into Gaza. In Gaza, we saw what was left of government buildings. A police station and a college were bombed. Outside the Al-Shifa hospital was an ambulance that was bombed, even with the large red crescent on its roof. At the hospital, doctors told us about children suffering from white phosphorus burns from the bombs. As they opened the wounds, the children would scream in agony as the air caused the skin to burn again. It burns to the bone. One woman we saw in a refugee camp had lost 28 family members. Another man told us how he could have saved his brother if the Israeli forces would have let an ambulance get to him. He watched his brother die just a few feet from him. In that incursion, 1,400 people were killed by Israeli artillery and airstrikes, mostly civilians. This was the first of 4 incursions into Gaza by Israel. The current attacks have killed 10 times that number killed during Cast Lead. Israel attacks because militants have been lobbing missiles into Israel, they say. The missiles were primitive until recently, and they rarely caused any injuries. Israel has high-tech smart bombs. We hear that Israel has a right to self-defense, but as an occupying army, Israel is the perpetrator of the violence. It is the Palestinians that have the right to armed resistance, but not to kill civilians. Now, Israel Prime Minister Netanyahu says he will eradicate Hamas. The trouble started before Hamas and will likely continue after Hamas is gone. There is no military solution in Israel and Palestine. What is missing is justice. When the United Nations created Israel in 1948, another UN resolution was passed known as UN Resolution 194, which grants Palestinian refugees the right of return to their homes in what is now Israel. This was never honored by Israel. The refugees that are still alive have their keys to their homes and are waiting for that day for justice to be served. The original plan was for a one-state solution. The negotiations between Israel and Palestine must start there. Thank you.